Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please look us up on your favorite podcast app, subscribe, like, and share so that you never miss an episode. If you'd like to further support us, visit patreon.com/speakingout and check out the different rewards. You'll find exclusive rewards if you sign up as a patron of the podcast. Thank you for your support, and let's get into the show. Well, welcome to this week's podcast. As always, we thank our patrons who make this podcast possible. And today we have a very special guest and good friend, Les Ferguson. Les is the author of this book, 2018, Still Wrestling, Faith Renewed Through Brokenness. This book was birthed out of a very deep tragedy involving sexual abuse of Les's oldest son at the age of 21.
Second oldest son,
sorry.
Okay.
See, I just have to make the intro kind of blended, keep you on your toes. But all of this happened less than the year 2011, the same year that our family's tragedy was unfolding, literally 2 months apart. Your family was experiencing a tragedy of its own. So, Les, thank you so much for being here. And we're just super honored to have you as guest today on the podcast.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So I failed to mention that you are the full-time preacher at the Oxford Church of Christ in Oxford, Mississippi. So you and I have known each other for, oh my goodness, how many years? Probably since 2012.
Yep.
So anyway, I'm going to let you just jump right in and assume that people don't know your story. Can you tell us about the events that led up to the day that your wife and your son were murdered back in 2011?
Okay. My second child name was Cole. Cole had physical and mental disabilities. He was diagnosed with cerebral palsy just before his 1-year birthday. And he had a pretty hard life at times. He had a good life at the same time, but he just had his struggles. And having a handicapped child in your home makes life difficult, period. It's hard to do some things that you want to do. And early on, it wasn't as much of a problem, but as he got older and as it became harder for him to move around on his own, it just was difficult. And so at some point in time, we asked around, we were looking for somebody that would come and sit at the house and sit with Cole for a couple hours, just so my wife could get out of the house on her own. And we had a gentleman for church that everybody was crazy about. He was kind of like everybody's grandpa, who volunteered to come and stay with Cole every Wednesday afternoon. And that took place sometime in the spring. The dates are all starting to blur at this point, but
yeah,
we just had the 10-year anniversary of their murders in October. At any rate, he started coming and sitting with Cole, and over time, Cole's behavior became more erratic. He began to act out. He began to do crazy things like push all of his DVDs and all of his game CDs down the hall in big stacks and dump them in the sink and turn water on because they were dirty, which made literal no sense to us. And then one day he indicated to his mother that somebody had touched him. And I think his words were "fooled around down there." And we immediately began trying to figure out what was going on. We brought in a counselor that very day who interviewed him privately and came back out and told us that she wasn't sure what all had happened, but something had happened. And I called. Is this too much detail?
No, you're good.
I called the Gulfport chief of police because he had just gone through a tragedy of a drunk driver hitting and killing his daughter. And his daughter's son and our youngest son were playing on the t-ball team together. And I reached out to him and prayed with him a number of times and just tried to be his friend. And so I called him and described to him kind of a hypothetical, and he just stopped me. He said, "This is not hypothetical. This is real. Don't go anywhere. I'm sending one of my sex crimes investigators to see you." And he came and talked to me. They set up a forensic interview, recorded it, videoed interview with our son. We weren't in the room, but they did that and came out and acknowledged to us that they were convinced that things had happened. And he made an odd statement to me that I didn't understand. That investigator looked at me and said, "If you ever are asked to watch the video of this interview, don't watch it."
Oh, wow.
And I just thought, well, hard to watch, because he had tears in his eyes when he said it. And eventually they did enough investigation. They couldn't find anything, but based on the interview, they arrested the gentleman in question. He was bonded out the next day by a church member, and all of that finally hit the news, what we were dealing with. It was a really, really a difficult time. People wondered about the fact that while they were investigating, my wife and children weren't coming to church. There were rumors of us getting divorced and having all kinds of marital problems. And we were just trying not to alert the man in question, and didn't want our son in the same, in his vicinity.
Absolutely.
And eventually, like I said, they arrested him. He bonded out. We announced to the church the next day what had happened. People were all over the map. It's just such a hard thing to hear, much less believe. And we rocked on for a while, waiting on the grand jury to do their thing. In the meantime, this man was not allowed to come to church. He couldn't have any contact with us. And there was a night about midnight when Cole got up out of bed and came down the hall into the living room and started telling us, we were watching a movie late, started telling us, that he wanted this man out. And he was so adamant and angry, and it was just, we were just hearing something we'd never heard before, seen before. And finally, I asked him if something else had happened, and the line he used. I don't know if you want me to say that on a podcast or not.
It's fine. Yeah, we're pretty raw on this podcast.
He made the statement that the man in question put toothpaste on his butt and gave him a big shot. And at that point, I about lost it that night. In fact, I did. In fact, my wife probably kept me out of jail. She wouldn't, whatever vehicle I got in, she stood behind to keep me from backing out.
Yeah.
I would have done something rash. I was so, you can imagine.
Full of rage, which is a righteous response.
Yes.
Righteous anger.
So that rocked on. We were trying to come to grips with all the failures it felt like as parents for allowing that sort of thing to happen, all the questions we had. And then on a Columbus Day, I was at a meeting, an area ministers meeting, having lunch with friends, and the man came to the house, and My wife fought him really hard and got our youngest son out, but he shot each of them, Karen and Cole both, in the head twice.
Hmm.
And then went to his home and got in the bathtub and killed himself.
And how did you find out? You were at a preacher's meeting with poor cell service, if I remember correctly.
Well, no, it wasn't poor cell service. Nobody would answer their phones. We just didn't know what was going on. My son had called. He was out with other kids from church playing putt-putt golf because it was a day off from school. It was Columbus Day. And he said, I've been trying to call mom and nobody answers. And somebody had called and heard yelling. And so I started calling, and I drove home calling constantly, pretty angry at all of them at home for not answering the phone and making statements to myself. We're putting in a landline back in this house. I'm not doing this anymore,
Yeah.
And I was passed by a number of police cars just screaming down the highway. And when I turned into our subdivision, it was just wall to wall law enforcement presence. And I knew. And in fact, I stopped a police lady and said, I know this is about my family. And she acted, well, of course, that was kind of shocking to her. I'm sure she had a million questions. How would you know? And she told me to stay put. And just a little while later, I got escorted by a bunch of policemen, kind of riot gear, SWAT gear, into their van. And that's where I stayed while they tried to get more information from me and going back and forth.
So that date, October 10th, 2011, obviously an absolutely horrific date. I remember the date. That date has significance to me because 2 years later to the day, I had my middle son, Cameron. You were the second person who I called from the hospital.
Yes.
And that date also has significance for you. What else was that date?
That was our wedding anniversary.
Yeah.
The day it happened was the 24th.
It's unreal to me.
It's too hard to even grasp, Les, what you went through. I can't imagine in my wildest, my mind just can't wrap around the torment that you and your wife went through, just knowing that something like that had happened to your son. And I really understand the questions you had, questioning yourselves. How could we as parents allow this? How did we not see? How did we not catch on to what Cole was trying to tell us? Why did we not? Why did God allow this? All we needed was a couple hours break once a week. The whole scenario. And yet the evil overrode everything. And I think out of your story, your life, if there's anything we need to pick up out of all of this, is that these abusers are not gentle little people who've made a mistake. They are evil, they are corrupt to the core, and they will do anything. They are monsters, and your life experienced it all. And
Clara, it's really worse than even you're hearing, because there's another aspect to this story that's really difficult, for me at least as a father. The whole concept of a grown man forcing that kind of sex on a disabled young man was something that I found incredibly difficult.
Oh, yes.
Not just to understand, but to believe.
Mhm.
Now,
Right.
this is going to come across and make me sound awful, but you just have to get through it to hear it, to understand it. I didn't want to believe that
Right. I get
because
it. I get it.
because I didn't
Yeah.
I didn't want to. A, I didn't want to imagine that my son had been through something like that. B, I
Right.
didn't want to, face the fact that I was somehow complicit in letting this man
Mhm.
come into our
Right.
home. So while my wife had no doubts whatsoever, I kept trying to find a way that this has got to be some kind of mistake.
Mhm.
Cole's misinterpreting something.
Mhm.
This is something. It's got to be uh, a mistake. And
Mhm.
how could he have made up something like this? In fact, the police told me at one point in time, I guess in a way to calm, because I was just terrified. As crazy as this sounds now, I was terrified about having somebody's life destroyed over
Mhm.
something that might not be quite
Right.
what
True.
what we
Real.
understood it to be,
Yeah.
what we thought. And
Mhm.
I remember him telling me that unless my son was watching hours and hours of pornography
Mhm.
or had lots of experience watching his parents in their room,
Oh.
that um, that there was no way he could make any of this up.
Mhm.
And we happened to know that he wasn't watching.
Right.
None of that was true. It was possible.
Sure.
So it was a very difficult time where I wanted to believe my son, but I didn't want to believe him.
Mhm.
And it caused some struggles, some angst, between my wife and I.
Absolutely. How
And
long, Les, was the investigation? What was that? Weeks? Was it days? Was it um
well, this happened. Man, I'd have to go back and read my own book. I believe we started looking at this in May or June,
so it
and
was
then
that long?
yeah,
That's
yeah,
yeah. That's a period of torment. That's what
yes,
I call it. It's a
yeah.
period of investigation for the police, for the law, but it's a period of torment for you and your wife.
And
And
in fact, I never knew until after their funerals, in a meeting with that me and my brother and my dad and I think my oldest son went to, with the police department, the chief of police and his sex crimes investigators. I that's when I finally realized what he meant by telling me not to ever listen
right, the
or watch the
videos.
tape,
Mhm.
because what their understanding was that he had been raped multiple times.
Oh,
Hmm.
You know, um,
mhm.
we did find out before it all went down, um, that he was making Cole take a little pill,
Yep.
and that he had brought a gun and would lay it on his pillow and tell him he would shoot everybody
Um,
if he told.
And this guy, I remember you blogging about this pretty early on, and the way you described him. I mean, when I was reading your blog, I was like, man, you are describing my own father. He's this guy
mhm.
that super soft spoken, the grandfatherly type guy, kept to himself, super friendly. Everybody liked him. People recommended him, as a safe person.
Mhm.
And I just think, I think that's what I always wrestled with is how do these guys put on such a facade that's so convincing? Because that's not who they are. They're not
Yeah.
nice people. They're not kind people. But they maintain that facade. And my dad did his entire life until he got caught.
Yeah.
And then the
He
facade came
never
down.
had, there was never any, the police never found a hint, that there was nothing there in his record
Mhm.
anywhere. And they told me that, it's obvious this wasn't his first rodeo, but he just never got caught. And those were their exact words. It's
Mhm.
not his,
Right.
obviously not his first rodeo.
Well, I have some questions, and while we're on the subject, I'm going to kind of ask out of order, just because this is, we're talking about this now. But when I when I train churches, when I consult with churches, when I blog, when I speak, I've spoken all over the country on abuse. I would say hands down, by far, the most common response to abuse by church leaders when a child sexual abuser enters the church doors is to rush to grace immediately for the abuser, not the victims, to not ask questions, and to say that in God's church, all must be welcomed. And I personally believe, I wrote about this in my book. You've read my book. You endorsed my book. I believe Jesus took a radically different approach to wolves in sheep's clothing. Why do you think that there's such a resistance on the part of the church leaders to admit that there genuinely are wolves whose only intention is to cause destruction, like Paul Buckman did to your son, like my dad did to his victims, and like every other abuser does to their young victims? Why is this such a big obstacle in the church for people to believe that there are genuinely evil people that we need to keep at bay?
Jimmy, as crude as this sounds, can you envision having sex with a child?
Never. Not in a million years.
Me either. And I think the average normal person can't imagine it either.
Right.
They just can't. I just can't comprehend it. I even after everything we've been through, everything your family's been through, I cannot comprehend how anybody, I'll use my redneck old-fashioned way of saying it, could get their jollies from a child like that. It blows my mind. So I think that's part of the problem. The nature of evil is such that when we're really faced with evil, we turn it off. We don't want to hear about it. We don't want to acknowledge it.
This is what blows my mind, though, because these are people who are convicted. For the most part, of course, we have admitted abusers who never spend time in prison. And I think we ought to safeguard our children equally as much from people who've admitted to it. But then you have convicted sex offenders that actually spent time in prison. And I find this time and time again, these leaders are bleeding hearts for these guys. I have never seen this much energy on the part of church leaders. I've never seen this amount of energy to protect victims as I've seen to protect abusers, and to say, yeah, but all are welcome. We need to open our doors to everyone, regardless of what they've done. We'll put a couple little precautions in place, and we're going to kick the doors wide open for these guys. And don't you dare step in the way of that, because that's not the gospel. And it makes me scratch my head, because I'm like, this is our response when we know what these people are capable of. We know what they're capable of because they did it.
I think it goes back to what Les is saying, that level of evil, that depth of evil, is often too much for us to imagine. We can't imagine it. We can't go there. I was reading a book on a girl. Her dad is a serial killer. He was, guess what? A great dad, a great husband. In the evenings when they would be asleep, he would go out and he murdered people. That was his thing. He murdered them. To get her to believe that, though, was something else, because she knew her dad as this kind, gentle man who was a wonderful dad and a wonderful husband. The man that murdered your wife and your son was known at church as this great guy, as was John, very nice, kind. So we see people that way, how we interact with them. We can't imagine, I still can't imagine what one of your sisters sat at my kitchen table with this morning and said, Dad is a child rapist. Those were her words. Dad is a child rapist. And I still, in my mind, you're right, Les, it's hard to go there because, number one, I don't want to. Number two, I can't imagine being that evil in your heart. That's evil. That's so opposed to God and what we should be. And yet these people wear the name of God, and that makes it so conflicting in our minds, I guess.
Yeah,
Is
Sure.
that, yeah, it just does.
Yeah, I think put it in a different term. If the church treasurer embezzled money, we can wrap our heads around that.
Right.
It's the the reality is all of us have struggled with greed.
Yeah,
Sure.
exactly.
Or wanted something we couldn't have.
Right.
And so we can let that person back in the church and be perfectly content with saying you can't ever be the treasurer or handle money again. And it's done.
Right.
It's done. But when it comes to children and people, we don't know how to keep people away.
No.
Yeah.
And again, and we still, it's incomprehensible.
Yeah.
Right.
It really is.
Would do the things they do and the way they act and you know, this I don't even know if I should say this or not. You may decide to edit it out, and that'll be up to you. But I've always heard that in any gathering of men, the 800-pound gorilla in the room that nobody wants to talk about is pornography.
Yeah.
Right.
And I wonder sometimes if these kind of things strike so close to home because we all know we're guilty in our own heads of sins that we want grace for.
I am very glad you said that because I take a firm stand on that always.
What? Say again?
I am very glad that you mentioned that because I take a very firm stand on that most people will say, well, you know what? I've dabbled in porn. I've looked at some raunchy stuff, or I've done some raunchy stuff, or when I was in my teens or when I was in my early 20s, I did some stuff that I never should have done. And who am I to point my finger at that person? And I really think that has a lot to do with the welcome arms saying, but for the grace of God, that could have been me.
Yeah, there go I.
There.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But what they don't realize is, no, it couldn't have.
No, and I know, but I think
I know. But yeah, they make
that's the thinking.
They make that bridge between adult pornography and and the abuse and rape of minor children. And I think that's a great point, Les. I think that's a fantastic point. Absolutely. Is that people relate their own lusts and struggles and whatever it is, they relate that and even equate that to the sexual abuse and victimization of minors, and it is not the same thing.
Their universes apart.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, I don't know if you're Dr. James Dobson years ago produced a video series called "Living on the Ragged Edge." I think that was Living on the Edge.
Yeah.
Living on the Ragged Edge.
Yes. Yeah.
And he interviewed in that video. He talked about interviewing Ted Bundy. I don't think he actually showed the interview, but he interviewed Ted Bundy when he was on death row down in Florida.
Right. Yep.
And in the interview, he said the lights actually dimmed. They actually were testing the electric chair when all that was going on. But Ted Bundy said that his path to becoming a serial murderer started with finding pornographic magazines in the alley behind his house that somebody had thrown out. And it took more and more and more and more and more and more to gratify him. And that's where he ended up. And so I think sometimes we do make that connection. That
we do.
Yeah,
we do.
But I think we do make that connection. Well, where would I be? Or
don't you also think there's a fear, especially among leaders, that let's face it, people aren't little angels, especially in their younger years. We've seen it in all these jury trials that come up and all. That's somebody will remember. There's a lady in the past that, well, this and this was done, or there was an affair that went on, something like that. They don't want to get involved because, God forbid, if my past shows up, there's this fear that, and so it's easier to say, let's just love everybody, love and forgive, because when you open that can of worms, we kind of open up ourselves to that same jurisdiction, so to speak. And
Jesus said, we're worried about a speck in somebody else's eye, and we got a beam in our own.
Yeah. And I think that is also a reason why it's like, I'd rather extend mercy than, judgment.
Err on the side of mercy. Yep, right. I hear that a lot. I'd rather err on the side of mercy.
Right.
And I'm like, but but no, like
the other facet of this, Jimmy, at least for me, is something I learned from you. In fact, I've asked you a couple times, where do I find that information? But one of the things I learned from you, and you got it from one of your sources, was that there's never been a known case of somebody, what's the word?
Being remediated.
Dr. Anna Salter talks about that in her book. She's a pioneer. I mean, an absolute tremendous pioneer in researching child sexual offenders. But yeah, she says, don't ever talk about, as a therapist, you don't ever use the terms remediated, healed. She's like, because it doesn't exist with child sexual abusers. She said, you can control them somewhat, you can put certain controls on them, but there is no such thing as a rehabilitated child sexual abuser. It doesn't exist.
That kind of flies in the face of what we're taught in Scripture. Paul said, he lists all those things and horrible things and says, and such were some of you, and because we teach everybody, there's nothing God can't fix. There's nothing God can't change. But in this case, fixing and changing doesn't mean a lessening of desire,
right?
Or whatever the right terms are. That's my perspective.
And in the Bible, I think too, it puts deceit in a whole nother category. And Paul in 2 Timothy 3 talks about all these different layers of deceit and deceitful people. And he says, verse 13 of chapter 3, he says, while evil people and imposters go on from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. And Paul's conclusion is, have nothing to do with them. Avoid such people. And Peter repeats it, Jesus repeats it, John the Baptist repeats it. So you do find these themes over and over again where there are classes of people who are so deceptive that that's all they know. They live it and breathe it. And they're so accustomed to deceiving that they're self-deceived, and they lie to themselves. And they think that they're just, they think that them and God are just super tight. And it's just crazy.
I think for me, if I'd like to think that I could do this as a leader in this situation at church. But if I wasn't a leader and I was asked about it, I think I might tell them, you know what, take this guy, whatever it is he's done, whatever he's accused of, and you put all kinds of restrictions on him that keep him away from children. And if he reacts to that badly, you have your answer.
You do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You really have your answer.
That's right.
But if a person accepts it contritely and never pushes those boundaries and is willing to work with whatever restrictions, then maybe God has worked on their heart.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And I've never seen anybody accept extreme boundaries and say, I deserve this and more. I've never seen it. I've seen people come back at church leaders. You don't believe in grace. I've seen them criticize them. They talk about finding Jesus in prison, on and on and on. And I could give you the scripted answers that I hear. And you're exactly right. there is your answer, whether they're to be trusted around anyone, adults included.
I just got word today that your dad is very actively writing letters, really wanting to get involved again in family, grandchildren, and whatnot. And I'm thinking, he's in prison for life. He will not let it go. He will not let it go.
But he targets people who are vulnerable. He doesn't write me those letters.
No,
he stopped writing me altogether.
Right.
Because he knows he can't get to me.
Yes.
So he can't control you anymore. It's all about control.
Absolutely.
Right. Yes.
And manipulation.
Yeah.
Very much so. Very much. But just till his dying day, I still see him doing that.
Yeah.
I see every abuser still doing that.
Yep.
They are relentless.
Yes.
Period.
Well, Lester, I want to talk about this too, because you are, as I mentioned, you are a full-time preacher. You're at Oxford Church of Christ, which is not where you were back in 2011. But in 2011, you found yourself in a somewhat similar place as I was. We both had tragedies, though very, very different. But both involving sexual abuse of minors in our families. Those happened 3 months apart. Your story ended in the tragic deaths of your beloved wife and your son, Cole. You were in a position of absolute submission to God with absolutely nothing left to give. Yet what people may or may not realize is we ministers don't get a break. You had to keep preaching. You had to keep leading a church, even though your life.
Actually, I didn't. I took a 6-month break and didn't do anything. But the pressure was there to come back.
Yeah.
And I wasn't ready. I couldn't.
Yeah.
And so I didn't.
Yeah. See, I didn't take that break. I was offered a break. I didn't take it, which that was my fault. But regardless, at the end of that 6 months, you had to keep preaching. You had to lead a church, even though your life was shattered into a million pieces.
Well, again, for me, I quit. That's when I got out of ministry altogether for a couple of years.
Yeah.
We've talked about this in the past, especially out at Tulsa. I never quit believing in God.
Yeah.
I sure doubted his love for me.
Yeah. Well, I think, this is the question that Mom asked repeatedly, because you're back into ministry, took a couple years off. But kind of, you had blogged about this too, talked about it at Tulsa. During that process, you had some pretty not so nice conversations between church members and you, directed at you. So how did the church respond to those tragedies, and what were their expectations of you as their minister?
When I early on in some of those blogs, I was pretty harsh. I have a lot more grace for some of that now, because I'm able to look back and see that there was no manual anywhere to consult for what to do when the minister's wife and one of his children are brutally murdered by a church member. They were just as much in shock, and there were lots of people that were mourning the loss. For some of those people, it was mourning the loss of 3 relationships, that they were close to. And, they didn't know how to handle it anymore, and I knew how to handle it. There were some folks that were just as good as gold and loving and kind, still have great relationships with. I have a good relationship with the church there, as far as I know. But there were a few people that had some hard things to say. I'll never forget the lady that looked at me one day. I was sitting in her house. I had gone to visit them, trying to figure out a way to keep doing a little bit of ministry here and there. And she looked at me and she said, well, I believe that Paul Buckman, the man, did those things to your son, but how much pleasure was he getting out of it?
Oh.
Yeah. And I was so,
whoa.
I just got up and left.
Whoa.
I didn't say anything.
There are no words. Yeah, there are no words.
And now, even now, looking back, I understand why she asked what she did, because she was having a very difficult time comprehending how in the world somebody could do something like that. And so her way of trying to understand it was to make it a party of two. And as horrific as that is, I really do see what she was doing. You know, she was trying to wrap her mind around the unbelievable, the inconceivable.
Well, I think she was questioning what all of us at some point question. Why doesn't the victim speak up? You and I and Jimmy know. Or why doesn't the victim do something to stop it? You know, Cole was 21, did you say? Yes. Even though disabled, he could communicate with you. But in people's minds, they might be thinking, well, why didn't he? Well, of course, we know why. It's too hard. It's stuffed inside. It's how do I say this? There's shame on the part of the victim also. There's a combination of a whole lot of things. Who will believe me? Who's going to believe that this happened? And so in our minds, we try to dilute it maybe sometimes and think, well, they didn't try to stop it, especially when the victim is older. I don't think that way, but a lot of people do. Yeah. A lot.
Well, in Cole's case, as I mentioned earlier, the man brought a gun with him and laid it on his pillow.
Right.
Hurt his parents and told him at one point he'd shoot everybody at church if he ever told.
That's awful. It's just horrible. It's just horrible. I mean, we know why. Yeah. There's usually a threat of some kind with
you got
abuse.
A kid who is, mentally, physically disabled. His thought processes, his logic wasn't always there. You know, his understanding level, they told us at times that he tested out at about a third grade level.
Sure.
You know, I mean, even when he told me that night about the toothpaste, he didn't even have
words to explain.
Yeah, that was the closest he could come to.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And also, I wanted to point out that when this happened, that's a period of time where we didn't hear about abuse every day. We do now.
Not nearly like today.
Today, the doors have been opened up, so we hear about it. We've been educated about it. It was way harder to believe in 2012, 2011, way harder because we were not subjected to it. We didn't know what we know today.
Yeah.
It was a way out there thing to think about, way out there.
And there's a word that we need to bring up that I'd never heard before, at least in this context, until you taught it to me, Jimmy. These abusers are not just grooming their sexual victim; they're grooming everybody all around them.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a nonstop process.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. And sometimes you'd almost think the abusers have the patience of a saint because they. It's a long-term.
They work it. They know how to work it. Yeah.
I think that's what people don't realize, but they need to realize is their level of commitment to it. And I use this analog a lot, but talking about magicians and getting up on stage and they don't just whimsically get up on stage and they're like, I'm just going to wing it today. They don't do that. They practice, they rehearse. It's all about technique. It's all about perfecting that skill level, but it's also about being incredibly dynamic and being able to change on a dime and to adapt. Because if somebody's seeing something that they're not supposed to see, who's in the audience, the magician doesn't have a meltdown and is like, oh crap, what do I do? You know, like they have a million different paths that they can take because they've rehearsed every single angle and they have it all down, and they can flow through it from start to finish, where at the end you're like, what just happened? And people need to realize, abusers are the same way. They're that committed, and they're that rehearsed, and they're that practiced, and every word, every intonation, every breath that they breathe.
Yeah, when you go to
is geared for abuse.
When you go to a magician show, you're already primed to believe.
Yes,
that's correct.
You're already ready to believe what you see. And when you build relationships with people, you know, you built them up to where they'll believe.
Right.
Yeah, you're primed to believe. Yeah, they're trustworthy. They're good people. They're good friends. They're
primed. We've been
Yeah.
So it's a long, convoluted process that gets us all.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would suggest, Jimmy, I don't know if you've ever thought about it like this. Is kind of new thinking to me, just like right now. When leaders are dealing with convicted abusers and they want to give them grace and all that, I'd suggest to you that they're in the process of being groomed right then.
Oh,
absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we have a good friend, Mom and I, who works in the prison, and he's a part of the parole board, and he uses the term, they know when to sit on attack, talking about the sex offenders. And he said, you know, he gave an example to me before, and he said, I had this guy, like the absolute hands down worst person in the whole prison. And he said, and also one of the most charismatic. And he's like, this guy's like Justin Bieber, you know, like good looking guy, young, probably had, you know, never lacked for a girlfriend when he was on the outside. Like this guy just was smooth. And he said this, you know, this guy, like the sex crimes that he committed were absolutely horrific. Like he wouldn't even tell me what they are. And I live and breathe this stuff. It was that bad. So, you know, he talked about this guy coming in his office and propping his feet. Like he sits down and just plops his feet on my friend's desk. And he's like, what do you think you're doing? And he's like, this guy walked in, you know, like he was all chummy and, you know, because he was coming up for parole soon, and he was trying to, you know, it wasn't working, but he was trying to butter him up and, you know, build rapport and all that stuff.
Buddy, best friend.
So, you know, he gives this example, and he said, this guy walks in the office and he's all cocky and, you know, calling him by his first name and, you know, just completely arrogant. He said he gets before the parole board, and this guy, you know, he shuffles himself in, you know, he's alligator tears are going down his cheeks. He's like, if you didn't witness both sides of this guy, you wouldn't believe it. And he said, every single one of them are like that. He said they're so good at acting at all the right times for all the right people. So yeah, I mean,
all the world's a stage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So yeah, you're 100% right. Well, I want to get on to your book because it is excellent. So your book, Still Wrestling, Faith Renewed Through Brokenness, that was published in 2018. A lot of people who've experienced tragedies at the hands of evil people in the church, they'll either renounce their belief in God or at a bare minimum, just struggle with church in general. Or quit church. You didn't. In fact, you're still, as we mentioned, you're still preaching to this day. So what led you to not give up on God?
Well, I think I didn't have anywhere else to go. Where else, you know, was I going to go? I didn't give up on God. What I had to give up was my flawed view of who God was. I think I lived for years in this bargain status with God. I'll do this, this, and this, and your end of the deal is you do this, this, and this. And when that didn't happen, it caused me to really rethink who God is and who I am. And I had to wrestle with the fact that I'm not the only person who has ever faced a tragedy. I'm not the only person who ever will. That there are tragedies that take place all around me, all around us, every day that we're unaware of. And it made me become a little bit more appreciative of the fact that we truly live in a broken world. And I just couldn't give up on God. I just had to fundamentally see him in a different way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't talk up your book enough because it just really resonated with me. And this idea of wrestling with God. And of course, you tell the story of Jacob when he wrestles with God, gets the dislocated hip, and it's this all night wrestling match with God. And God renames him that night. And what your book did for me, and just you living your life, has taught me that it's okay to struggle, to wrestle with God. Like as Christians, even as Christian leaders, we don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes there are no answers to life's tragedies. You cannot put into words that level of destruction and wickedness and trauma and loss and brokenness, all those things. You can't physically find the words to describe that. And so, taking away those nice, clean answers that we give people, those pat answers that, if, like you said, if you do this, God will, do this for you. If you live your life this way, these are the blessings that will follow. And, we learn pretty quickly that in a world involved with people, those ideologies get messed up really quickly. And it leaves us really, really confused, heartbroken, and wrestling with God, trying to figure out who he is. I had to figure out who God was, because the God who I thought I knew, he was long gone.
So I'm working on a sermon for this coming Sunday. I'm doing my annual thing of Christmas sermons in the month of December. But I'm doing this passage, Matthew 2 verses 1 through 12, the story of the Magi, or the wise men.
Yeah.
And it's been really interesting to me. It was like a 2x4 between the eyes. We've always focused on the Magi, and you can't grow up as a preacher's kid and not have heard somebody talk about the wise men. Wise men still seek him today, type of thing. But I've been looking hard at Herod, because Herod, I'm saying my sermon is a precursor to all of us. Because what got Herod so upset was that the birth of a child was going to move him off his throne. And that's the reality that all of us have to deal with God, is in order for me to have a relationship with God, I got to get off the throne. And I think that was a large part of what I was dealing with. I was a preacher, still am. I was a minister, still am. I've given my life to serve in the church and want to continue to do that. But my human tendency was to still try to keep my hand in on being on the throne of my life. And when all of this happened, I think for me, I realized that my throne didn't have any power, and it was completely dismantled. Now, The struggle for me is that in the aftermath, the more time that goes by, the easier it is to start assembling my throne again.
Hmm.
I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The easier it gets to slowly but surely make me more important than me needs to be. And I think, I'm kind of all over the map, and I apologize. You may have some heavy editing to do.
No, you're good.
But I think that was the shock of all this, with my belief and understanding of God, wasn't so much that God was different. The more I try to say it, I'm going to say it like this: it's that I needed to realize that I was different. I wasn't what I thought I was.
Yeah.
And God was much more than I had given him credit to be. And that I was not, I didn't have anywhere near the ability to bargain with God.
Yeah, I think when you're stripped down, when everything in your life that you hold valuable, that you cherish, when all of that's stripped away, it leaves you in such a raw state. And I know my experience was God became a lot more real in that moment, even though I was crazy mad at God.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember, and I wrote about this too. I remember just screaming at God to the point where I was hoarse. I was so angry.
Oh,
at,
yeah.
at
I
God.
shook my fist at the sky so many times it wasn't funny.
Yeah.
Stomped my foot and demanded answers.
Yeah, absolutely. But what that did, and I like that. I really like that analogy, that it strips you off of your throne, because any semblance of control that you thought you had, that's all gone. That's all completely stripped away. And you really start to question, okay, who is God? If God isn't this guy who just protects, he's this God that protects everybody. And if you're just good enough, he'll protect you and your family. You'll have good health. You'll have wealth. You'll have all these blessings. When that ideology is stripped away, it really causes you to search and to ask, like, who are you, God?
Mm-hmm.
And I found that process to be both grueling and beautiful.
Yeah.
And I found this God in the scripture who emerged, who was a protector, a radical protector of the innocent and the vulnerable, who doesn't tolerate deception and wickedness and people who act worse than animals. God is infuriated by those things. So yeah, I mean, your book really, really, really helped me. I can't emphasize that enough. It just helped me to understand God better and to understand myself better, and to say, like, it really, really is okay to wrestle with God.
I think when we wrestle with God, it's not just a wrestling with God, but it's a wrestling with our relationship with God. And
Yeah.
where was that relationship? Where is it now? I feel like I've been, not just with what happened with your dad, but with the sudden death of Mike, with other tragedies we've had in the family. When you're knocked flat, it's a comfort to say, okay, God, I'm yours. Show me the way, show us the path. You're mine, I'm yours. Just help, and he's always there. God has never, that's the one constant, that's the only constant that's been in my life, is that God has always been there. It's it's easier, I should say, easier to just say to God, rather than me be in the throne in the driver's seat, for me to say, God, lead me. Just take my life and do what you have to do with it. Take my kids. do what you have to do in their lives. And God does, by the way.
And that's a scary place to be too.
It is, but it's just a lot. For me, it's easier, it's better, it's more comforting than for me to be in the driver's seat and try to figure everything out. And I think when God allows us to be knocked off that throne, he's there to scoop us up, and he's there to really strengthen that relationship. That's our choice, by the way. And like you and Les indicated before, some people walk away while others use introspection and work on wrestling with this relationship. God is, we are in a relationship with God. It's not just that God is a distant being. He dwells within. So, Les, your life has been a light to many of us, to many of us. The horrific things that have happened in your life, many people could not have withstood. Your relationship with God obviously is one that is rich and strong and pure, and that shows, or you would not be sitting where you are right now. And we are so glad you're here with us.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm grateful for what the Hintons have meant to me over the past 10 years, 8 years, 9 years, whatever.
Yeah. And likewise. So I will end on this note. You have since remarried. You married way up, I might add.
Oh, boy, did I.
You're now part of a beautiful blended family. What is your final parting word of advice for people whose world has been shattered by wickedness, like yours was? What if you were to whisper something in their ear and just say, this is what I wish I knew back then, what would you tell them?
3 years before Cole and Karen were killed, one of my closest friends, my college roommate, we'd been buddies since he was 17 and I was 18. And you know him, John Dobbs. John lost his son in a tragic accident. And of course, we were there with John during all that. And I remember John telling me in the aftermath of our tragedy, fairly early on, he kind of whispered to me, it won't always feel this bad.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I just have to tell you, I had to hold on to that because it felt really bad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, I wanted that pain to end so badly I couldn't see straight. And you know what? I can have an interview like this today and it's okay. We can talk about it. It hurts, Thanksgiving's always tough for me because it's always right around the date of Cole's birthday. But it doesn't hurt as bad as it did. That pain will always be there. The hurt will just always be there. But it's not as bad as it was. And God has a way of bringing hope back in where it seemed like there was none. And one of the things
great parting words, by the way. Yeah.
Do what?
I said, I think those are great parting words to just, let people know that it's not going to be this bad all the time. It won't hurt this raw all the time.
I have a theological belief about communion. And of course, we come from a heritage and tradition that practices weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. But I believe that in communion, the veil goes away, and that we are not just communing with each other, but we're communing with the saints that have gone on before us. And so I can take some comfort in that fact that, I can't figure it out and I can't see it all, but somehow during that time, I'm connected to my child, to my family.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing.
That's a comforting thing to me.
Yeah.
I haven't worked out all the ramifications of how it works and all that, but I believe that and know it.
Yep. Yeah. That's pretty incredible. Well, Les, as always, my good friend, it's good to see you. So thankful that you joined us today.
Have a great Christmas.
Yeah, you too. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. I hope you've been impacted as we are by our good friend Les and his story. And just remember, there's always hope in the midst of tragedy. Les, thank you very much. And to our listeners, we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. A special thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. Please help us get the word out by searching for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. Please consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the rewards our patrons receive.